Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, a podcast that aims to address divorce, separation and co-parenting here in the UK, countering the often sensationalist way it's portrayed in the media, challenging the status quo and driving for reform. On each episode, I'm joined by experts to discuss divorce, separation and co-parenting from different angles and to give their opinions and to debate them. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor and divorce coach, co-founder of Amicable, the divorce services company, and host of the Divorce Podcast. In this episode, I was joined by Helen Adam and Kate Stanley. Helen started her work with separating families as a solicitor in London. Following a career break, she retrained as a mediator and founded Wells Family Mediation. Helen's currently the chair of the Family Solutions Group, which presses for coordinated political oversight and funding for separated families. Kate is Executive Director of Frameworks UK, a not-for-profit communications and research organisation that helps mission-driven organisations achieve the social changes they seek. Kate's career has focused on bringing about social change with a particular focus on children and families, including her roles as Board Director of the NSPCC, Deputy Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research, and her earlier work with Save the Children. We discussed the power of language in shaping and reforming social issues. The language that's used in policy and in wider society has a real impact on people going through divorce and separation. And we talk about the changes in language brought in with the Children's Act and the move away from the language of battle towards more cooperative language. We explore other social issues too and how shifting the language has had a positive effect. This is a really interesting topic and one I personally feel very passionately about. I hope you enjoy. If you really loved this episode or want to hear more episodes like this, then please make sure to rate us on your preferred listening platform. Enjoy the episode. It's lovely to see you both. Thank you very much for joining me. This is a really fascinating episode all about language and how language contributes both to the outcomes and the choices people make when sorting out divorce and separation. So it's a really important topic and one I feel personally really very passionately about. So I wonder, Kate, if I could start with you just to set the scene. Why is it important to consider language when it comes to social issues such as divorce or separation?
It's really simple, really. Words matter. Our words shape how we think about issues, how we understand them, and therefore how we behave. So it drives everything. And simple changes in the words we use can lead to changes in the way that we think about things, the way we feel, and the way we behave.
In divorce and separation, what have been the really sort of negative words and how have they shaped the changes? I wonder if I can ask that to Helen.
Well, I mean, sadly, the kind of context of family separation in our country is all framed around battle language. And, you still hear people talking about custody battles, as though this was a kind of normal thing and a kind of fighting over our rights. And, we have the Inspirational Children Act, which came in, but it sits there on the statute books, but the philosophy behind it has not permeated into society because, of course, the only thing that we offer as a society is a family court. And so everything is framed in the context of one person against another person, which, if you add that to the kind of fragility of a time of family separation, it's just like pouring fuel on the fire and everything, it sort of ups the ante, and everything is more toxic, more adversarial. We have created a system which fuels hostility, hence the need for a radical reframe.
And just to go back a couple of steps then, just so people who perhaps aren't, subsumed in this kind of world understand. So at the moment, it's not that divorce has a particular kind of battle-led language, although clearly it does. It's more that we have an adversarial justice system, and at the moment, sorting out divorces and children arrangements sits within that adversarial justice system. That's the key point here.
I think It's really interesting what you say, because I think this affects the political responsibility for the millions in our society who live in families in different homes. Because if you put everything under the Ministry of Justice, whose job it is to administer justice, and they do that with the criminal justice system and all the prisons, and you put family separation under justice, then all that will happen is that the administration of justice takes place. But it then obviates the need for other forms of support from other departments. And so I think it's actually very important, this language point, because how are we going to get the Department of Education or the Department of Health and Social Care to get involved if everything is framed as a justice issue? But that's a sort of more political perspective rather than what will affect the kind of parents directly. But I think it has massive implications for society.
But Kate, then doesn't language affect how people approach a problem as well? Is that part of this issue, that if we frame language in, as Helen's pointed out, in a sort of battle mindset, one against the other? I mean, even the court papers say versus, don't they, still? And if you come at it from that perspective, will that affect how people engage with a problem?
Yeah, so what if divorce wasn't the start of a battle? It was the beginning of the peace talks. It was the beginning of the renegotiation of the next phase, what was going to happen. That starts you from a very different set of mental ideas. So we're not, each of us are full of these different ideas that we use to understand the world around us, right? We're not blank slates. We carry around with us all kinds of what we call mental models or mindsets in our heads. And we use those mental models, those patterns of thinking and reasoning, to figure out whether we agree with something or not, how we feel about something, and what we're going to do. And rather than having to reinterpret the world anew when we wake up every morning, we use what's already in our heads and our experiences and these mindsets that are formed to decide how we're going to behave and what we're going to do. And so if the world of family separation and divorce is full of these ideas that draw on conflict, adversarial systems, war, battle metaphors, then we're bringing a lot of baggage to those conversations that sets us in a particular way of thinking and informs how we behave. So if we want to shift that, and if we want to help people bring a different kind of mindset to the process, then changing the language is a decent place to start. It's never the only thing to do, because of course, if you're using brilliant language in the context of a really adversarial system, there's only so much difference it's going to make. But it can make a difference. So we've got to start with what we can do, right? And we've got to start with what we can change, or what is in our sphere of influence, if you like. So it's not the whole story, but it can be a place to start. And to help people have a different kind of conversation and approach things slightly differently.
And Helen, you mentioned the Children Act. Can you just give a very brief overview of what that is? So in the context of two parents who are separating and divorcing and need to sort out the arrangements they have for their children, what's the Children's Act? What does it mean?
So the Children Act is a really inspirational piece of legislation which came in the early 90s. It came into force in 1991. And it said in section 1 that the welfare of the child is the most important thing for any family. And it did away with the old concepts of custody and access. And if you think of custody, I know it gets used in America, and I know it gets used in other jurisdictions, but basically in this country, we said in the Children Act, we don't own our children in the way that I own the pen that I'm holding. It's my pen and I can do what I like with it. But I don't own my children. And custody has a kind of ownership context to it. And it replaced that sense of they're our children, we own them, with a new concept which was introduced 30 years ago called parental responsibility. And basically it set in statute the responsibility that every parent has to provide for the well-being of their child. And that really drives everything else. And that legislation was then followed up many years later with the Children and Families Act. And now we simply have legislation which basically says we, the family courts, don't want to be involved unless there are real safeguarding concerns. We think parents know what's best for their children. We want to leave it to parents to make wise decisions for their children. And we, the lawyers and the courts, should stay well out of the way. That's really what the English law says now. But sadly, as I said earlier, that's not well understood. Many people still think that they have to fight for custody and sort of go to court, to enforce their parental rights. And, somehow we need to turn that all around so there's a greater understanding of what the statute actually says.
Yeah, I think you're right. We still have a lot of people who, want to talk to us about custody. We say, well, custody doesn't exist. And people are concerned about, well, we've made an agreement. How do I know that my other partner is going to stick to the agreement? And people seem very concerned about that. But again, I think you're right. If we can change the language to this being an ongoing responsibility for your children that you'll have to navigate as they grow, rather than something that's got to be written down on a piece of paper that even next term we all know how schedules change will be out of date, then I think that would be a really positive way forward. But just to summarise then, there's no custody, there's parental responsibility that people have, and there isn't this need to document anything. So I think we also have what's called the no order principle, whereas you said the court's perspective is you sort this out between you parents, don't come to the court to get involved.
That's right. And they want to promote cooperative parenting between parents. And of course, there's support out there. No one's saying this is a very easy thing to do when a relationship breaks down. People are feeling afraid and vulnerable and want to protect their children and protect themselves. So, there's support that's needed, and things like your co-parenting app, Kate, is all great. There's lots of co-parenting resources out there, but everything in the absence of safeguarding concerns. And that is important because, of course, there are large numbers of families where there are concerns about domestic abuse and child protection. But, in the absence of those issues, we should all be encouraging and supporting and gathering around parents on a kind of pathway towards cooperative parenting as the way that the law expects parents to fulfill their responsibility. I think as much as anything, it's about flipping the coin from parental rights on one side to parental responsibility on the other.
Can I ask you both a question? Because often we find that in places where the language lags behind changes, so you've talked about there's been changes made, but actually there's a lag with the language. People are still using the language of 10, 20 years ago that doesn't apply anymore. Often we find that's because it is serving the interests of a particular group. Does the adversarial language serve the interests of a group here?
It does. And in fact, one of the things that would be really interesting to talk about is whether or not the new divorce law makes any change. And I was reflecting on that. And I think the group of people that it most speaks to are the lawyers. It's a reminder to all those who work in legal practice that the legal system is not interested in who did what. The legal system is there not to provide justice in terms of what their client thinks is justice, but actually to point a family forwards and to help them find the best outcome going forwards where their children can thrive and where it's a fair outcome. Whose idea of justice that is, I'm not sure. But I think you're right, Kate. And I think the language of justice and this adversarial approach is very familiar and natural to family lawyers, but it isn't actually what their clients need.
So actually the responsibility for making that shift really does sit with the legal profession, who are continuing to use an outdated language that isn't actually serving their clients very well.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case, because part of what we've tried to do with Amicable is to use normal language, everyday language that isn't driven from a legal perspective, but is driven from we're human beings, we're people. So, for example, we never refer to people as parties. They're always people. That's my biggest bugbear. And it seems whenever you get into any sniff of a legal conversation, parties is the word that's used all the time, but it dehumanizes. And we are people struggling to do the very best for our children under really difficult circumstances at a time when we're probably not being our best because of all the emotional turmoil that we're going through. So I think trying to change the language of the profession and doing that by role modelling, we're no less professional because we don't use highfalutin, complicated legal language. We can deliver a really good service to people and help people genuinely, but with a really human touch. And I think that's absolutely critical. And I think the whole industry has to make that change. And I think that I used to do a lecture with the very lovely Richard Moorhead at UCL, and I used to go and talk to law students, and it starts there, because the way that people are taught about the law shapes the way they then deliver the law and deliver their professional services. So I think it goes all the way back to the courses, the way people are trained to work in the legal profession, because if you get the language right from day one, there's nothing to change. You've done the shift. Whereas when you've got people who've been through a very long process, it's very hard to change that mindset because they're steeped in it from all different angles.
I think what we also find, though, is dehumanizing language isn't a side effect or an unintended consequence of a language choice. It's actually a deliberate strategy very often, because it enables people to say really tough things that they wouldn't want to say. It enables people to put people at arm's length. It's partly like psychological protection because it dehumanizes and it makes it safer and easier for the legal professionals and anybody else. It's entirely understandable because this can be unpleasant, nasty, but also the consequence of that is that it is actively dehumanizing and leads to choices and decisions being made that people wouldn't otherwise made if they felt like if they were having a more human conversation. So it can be a deliberate strategy, both a self-protection, but also to win, as it would be seen. And I think that is why that kind of language can continue to be used, even though it feels wrong and it's actually out of date.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an awful lot in family law which aligns with other forms of law where, in fact, family law is just radically different from all other forms of law. I mean, if you think about contract law or the law of tort, it all looks back at what happened, gathers evidence and tries to right wrongs. That's what it does. Family law is not interested in looking back at who did what. It's all about creating positive futures. And so, in one sense, studying law to help couples when they're separating is a contradiction in terms in some sense, because the aim is that we all as professionals help these families to separate in a way that is fair, that is reasonable, that meets the needs, and that provides the best outcome for the family. Now, there's some law in that, but there's a lot of other skills that come into that. There's nothing about law. And I think family law has too dominant a place in the field of family separation. If you think about it as a pie chart, I would see it as about the sort of 30% of the 360 or 30 degrees of the 360 degrees in a pie chart. It sits there, but alongside all the other important skills that are needed when coming alongside a family who separate.
Well, yeah, we always say the way that we articulate it is that that divorce and separation is an emotional journey with legal and financial consequences. So that just puts the onus on the emotional journey, because that's the important journey that you're on. The legal and financial consequences, of course, need attending to, but they're not what drives the outcome of a separation. What drives the outcome is the emotional resilience, the emotional journey, the emotional management, the emotional skills that people bring. And if we work on those, we can achieve much better outcomes financially and legally by focusing on the emotional side. That, to me, is a really important way of conceptualizing it.
People are in a better place to make adult rational decisions when they've had the support emotionally. Yeah.
And we talk about solicitors, but what about the judges and the judiciary, the people who, ultimately, if things haven't gone to plan and you do end up in the family court, what do those people in charge of that courtroom, and we've done a lot, haven't we, to try and make family court more friendly? There's no wigs, there's no gowns, all of that kind of stuff. But what are the other changes, do you think, Kate, that need to happen to make a process that's effectively going in that direction more palatable and derive a better outcome?
I'm just trying to imagine the idea of talking to judges about divorce as an emotional journey, first and foremost, with the legal and financial implications, which seems profoundly important and is at the heart of what you're talking about, but feels so very far removed from how others in the profession would describe it and would feel comfortable describing it, actually, because there'll obviously be professional pride at putting the legal process at the heart, because if you're a lawyer, that's what you're bringing, right? So it's about getting your own head around the kind of different balance of skills, as Helen has described, that's important here. So I think it's really, for us, how we approach an issue like this. How do you bring about, first of all, work out what's going to work well as different language? What's the problem? What's going to work better? And how do you then get people using it? So for us, what we do is start with, where are people at right now? So what are the mindsets that people are bringing to this issue? So what are judges? What are lawyers, mediators, others? What are they bringing? What are they thinking? What are their set of assumptions? Work out that, then work out where you want them to be. How would you get them closer to this idea of an emotional journey? What are the gaps between the two? And then we map different ways of talking about the issue, different ways of framing the issue, and figure out what could bridge those gaps. What's a different way? What's a different language that could bridge the gap between where we are and where we want to be? And then we test those strategies. So this isn't about what we like, what sounds good to us, what we'd be comfortable with, because we're not our audience, right? But we actually test what works in reality, what actually works to move people so they think differently about the issue. They bring a different set of ideas to the issue. So we find, for example, just to give you an example from another field, we did some work on childhood obesity. And we found if you start a conversation by talking about obesity, people bring a whole set of ideas that really obesity is an issue of willpower. Are you going to choose not to eat that? Or is it good or bad parenting? Are you going to choose to give your kid that or not? It's all about individual choices. But we found if we start the conversation by talking about children's health and about having, then we can talk about food options that are available, what's put in front of them, what's marketed to them. People bring a whole different set of ideas to the conversation and are then much more likely to support changes to the food environment, to how food's marketed, to what's by the till, to the advertising that children are exposed to, and so on. So how you start the conversation, what you begin with, how you frame it, led to radical changes in people's behavior, attitude, support for change, and so on. So, and that's what we would really need to do here, is to understand what's the language that's going to make people bring a different set of ideas to this process, a set of ideas around an emotional journey, a set of ideas around a renegotiation, rather than battle, war, conflict, winning, losing.
Well, I liked how you described it before as a peace process. That really resonated with me. Helen, I don't know how far along you are with your family solutions group in terms of this work, but are there some early indications of the sorts of language that needs to change? Are there some examples of words that we need to stop using and words that we need to start adopting?
There's a long list. We've tried to break it down into different sections because people use language around family separation in different contexts. So as Kate has just been saying, there's the language used in the formal court arena and how to shift that and, how to make it more about thriving childhoods and less about battles between parents. And if we introduce the goal of a thriving childhood and everything being future-focused, child-focused, how does that then change the language being used? So a classic example that happens in court the whole time is that barristers or solicitors refer to the other side or my opponent. It just rolls off the tongue the whole time. And, that's unhelpful. That is the boxing ring analogy. So, this has got to be reframed as people coming together to do some problem solving because the parents are stuck, essentially. And so there's something here which is about, obviously, plain English, has to be plain English, and it mustn't serve the legal professionals. It needs to serve the clients whom we serve. It needs to be personal. We don't want applicant versus respondent. It needs to be, in the matter of the Adam family, or, it needs to list the family members. And I think some of us would be quite keen on any application form having a question, how would you like to be referred to? Is it Mrs. Adam, Ms. Adam, Helen, mother, how do I want to be referred to when I turn to somebody for help because I'm stuck? So it needs to be personal, it needs to be plain English, and it needs to be problem solving. I think it needs to point towards positive futures. And I think there's something in there which is about what's going well. Because the court arena attacks, criticizes everybody for all their failings. Actually, let's at least have a mutual statement in front of any decision maker, who may be called a judge, but that's an unhelpful term. Let's have a mutual statement of what's going well. There's a whole lot that is going well and that we are managing, but we're stuck on these bits. And again, that's about, pointing forwards and capturing what's good and not annihilating each other. I think there's some kindness that needs to come into all of this, and humanity. And it's certainly in mediation, I would often discuss with clients the fact that as parents, we're just not perfect. We do make mistakes at times. We might send our child in without their gym kit on a Tuesday. You know what? Let's just bear with one another and not make a drama. Let's be kind and encourage each other. And this is all la land to parents at war. But if the system can start to use a different way of approaching the parenting journey which follows separation. I think it's going to take time, and obviously Kate's the expert here, but if the language of the system starts to reflect that future-focused children thriving agenda, then perhaps it may filter down.
And Helen, you were sort of talking about the language of divorce, and you were saying that obviously we don't have to have the really awkward conversation that sets things up in the wrong way about whose fault it is. But there have been some other language changes, moving away from the use of Latin to plain English. So decree nisi, decree absolute becoming conditional order and final order. Do those things make any difference, or are they just kind of subtleties?
It's all going in the right direction, isn't it? But, the divorce petition, as was just one piece of difficult court paperwork. We have a lot to do with the application when somebody gets stuck in the arrangements for their children, currently called a C100, fraught with unhelpful terminology. And we have what is known as Form A, which is what you have to file if you're stuck and need help in sorting out your finances. So I think there's a whole load of plain English that needs to come into this. What we can't do on the Family Solutions Group working group is rewrite the whole of the family procedure rules. This is a big task. And ultimately, I think it comes back to what we said at the beginning, which is that change of language to make it personal, plain English, problem solving doesn't change the fact that it is an inherently adversarial process. So there's got to be some conversation amongst those who head up the system about the extent to which radical change is possible within our current legal framework. And if we can get barristers and solicitors using more problem solving language, within the current structures, I think that will filter out. But my concern is, and certainly when the new law came in, is that at the moment, society's response to any form of family separation issue is to ring the local family lawyers and to get them sound bites. Actually, as I said before, there's a whole raft of other people working in the field of family separation. But until the media understand that other people are involved in supporting families, and this isn't purely a legal thing, we're going to be stuck. And so we have to change the law bit first for it then to filter out to everyone else. That's I think, how we see it. I don't know whether Kate Stanley would agree with that, but it comes back to the kind of point about language serving a particular group.
Well, I was going to ask you, Kate, are there examples? It's not that yet there in the arena that we're talking about, but are there other examples where this has worked, where language has led to a social change and a social reframing of how we see an issue?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of examples. Probably one of the most transformational is what's happened around the language of early childhood. This work began in the States and it's also had an impact over here. But a group of top scientists got together to say, how do we convince people that the early years matter? That what happens in the earliest weeks and months of life has radical impacts for the rest of your life. We know this from the science, and yet we behave like this is an almost irrelevant moment. And you only really start being human when you can talk. How do we get investment in the early years? And there was a sustained effort over a period, actually, of about 20 years, to bring the language and the insight from science into everyday language and everyday use. So we developed, for example, some metaphors that help to simplify complex ideas, which is what you'd be doing in the law, right? So the idea of the interaction between a caregiver and a baby, that back and forth interaction that actually physically builds the brain and that causes neurons to fire and basically makes you who you are. And we call that serve and return. So the baby or the carer does something and the other person responds. And it's this back and forth interaction over the net. I'm going to lob it here, I'm going to whack it. And it's a back and forth game you're playing together of serve and return. And it's that simple back and forth interaction that builds our brains and our bodies. And suddenly playing peekaboo goes from something silly that you may or may not do to what actually building your baby's brain, and is actually developing them as a person, helping them to understand human interaction and enriching their experiences. And it suddenly becomes elevated in its importance. Similarly, we talked about stressful environments, because often people would think about, what doesn't break you makes you stronger. In actual fact, we know that in early childhood, too much adversity is actually toxic to the body and the brain, and has this toxic stress effect where, again, those stressful experiences can get built into the body and the brain, and without the right help at the right time can lead to long-term consequences. So by helping shift understanding of the experience of stress in early childhood, again, it helps shift understanding that we needed to do more to prevent children experiencing adversity in the early years and to offer more help to families who are struggling. Those different changes have led to a massive investment in early years education and care, a much greater appreciation of the value of child caring as a profession, and a big change in the shift of resources into that period of time. There's still a long way to go, but those changes in language to illuminate those ideas really made a difference.
And listening to this conversation that we've been having about, family consequences, the consequences of separating as parents, what are the key things you think that are required from a policy perspective to make or help some of these changes embed? Because Helen has been working on this. The Family Solutions Group have been working on this. We're not short of ideas. I think, quite a few of us could get into a room and map out the changes that are required. So it's not that we don't know, but it's that struggle of how you embed it. We have been, I'm going to say fighting, not quite the right word, negotiating with HNCTS and the MOJ regarding the government website that handles all of this and the language on that, and even simple things where there are clear errors in language being used, and trying to campaign for them to change some of the language. It's like pushing water uphill. It's a really difficult task. So what has to happen? Because I think we've got some great ideas, but from your experience, Kate, what has to happen to get all the ducks in the row for the change to happen?
I think one of the fundamentals that's really important is being really clear about why the change is needed. So I think some of the things that Helen was talking about earlier are really important in terms of just acting with greater compassion towards one another is an important thing in itself. But often the case that we need to make is, why will this change decision making? Because often those with a vested interest are more interested in outcomes than process. Like, so what's going to change as a result of this? Yeah, people might feel nicer, okay, fine, but we haven't got time for that, is often the kind of reaction. We need to explain how a shift in language will actually shift outcomes, how it makes a difference. So if there's evidence that we can draw on in those niche places, perhaps, where a different approach is being taken and demonstrate it does lead to better outcomes and it actually serves people better, leads to a more effective and efficient system where children in particular, but others are better served, then that's the case that we need to be making. Show how it matters, because different language leads to different outcomes. Not just that we feel better about the process, but it can actually change the decisions that are made.
Well, I guess the outcome we would all want, Helen, is that fewer people would end up in family court. That seems to be the biggest outcome we could hope for, isn't it? There are 50,000 cases every year ending up in the family courts. They don't all need to be there. In fact, the majority of them don't need to be there. So how do we shift, if that's the outcome we want, what the Family Solutions Group proposing to do or proposing in terms of changes that would change that outcome?
I mean, I think a lot comes back to coming alongside families at an early stage for a really well professionally managed early triage. I would say that the family court is needed and vital for some families. And I have slight concern about the sort of political moves there's a piece in the Sunday Times at the weekend, again, with this very unhelpful reference of parents clogging up the courts as though it was the parents' fault. The fact is the family court exists because some families really need it. And so the goal is that those who need the court have access to it in a way that is supportive, that is not intimidating, and which provides the safe outcome that they need, but that it is not the go-to place for everybody because they don't know where else to go. So I would say, in the same way that Kate describes the transformation in the early years of children, we need a transformation in early support, the early time of a family separation. If you think of that, the transition that takes place from the moment a relationship breaks down, whether it's a one-night stand or a kind of 30-year marriage, the transition from that time of breakdown and the years which follow, actually, we need upfront support, information, signposting right in that early bit, so that those families who are at risk can be signposted to the robust safety protection that they need, but that the majority of families have access to emotional support, really clear information about the benefits to their children of a long-term goal of co-parenting, access for support for their children. And if they're teenagers or age 10 or whatever, we would say that the children need to be consulted somewhere along the lines in all of this, and they need their own support. And then there's a piece there which is about a process which is supportive and collaborative to help them make decisions and find their solutions. And that might involve mediators. I don't think mediation is the answer for everyone. I think there are some really fantastic models involving great lawyers who work together in a supportive way, and some people want to pay for that. That's fine. I think we should have access to basic legal information. Everybody should have it.
For free.
On a means-tested basis, exactly, because people need to know. So there's a lot about providing upfront information and signposting really early on. And the interesting thing is that all of us on the Family Solutions Group, and I'm sure you, Kate, Stanley as well, and those at Amicable, okay, we all come from sort of different backgrounds and have come into this from different ways. We all agree it's not rocket science. We all absolutely agree on what's needed. Families need support at an early stage rather than left with a great big void, a language of justice, the family court looming in the distance, things unravel, and that's where they end up.
That's sometimes an attraction of the family court. It's cheaper than a mediation system. And for people who are struggling, often it's that people end up in the family court for lots of reasons, some of which are it's cheaper, than any other process.
Yes, there is some light on the horizon. The MOJ have now extended their mediation voucher scheme. And so any couple where there are children, where there's any discussion about their children, are entitled to a £500 voucher towards their mediation fees. But I must say, I think mediation can be very, very helpful for many at the right time, in the right way. But I'm not happy with any suggestion from government that parents will be penalised. You know, what we need to do is offer the carrot into positive processes at the point of separation, rather than wait till they get to court and then bash them with a stick. You know, it's not helpful. It just makes everything more acrimonious and more adversarial. You know, if the system then bashes them with a stick when they end up in court, actually we need to give them reasons why doing it differently right from the very beginning is better for them. It's better for their children. It's better for their future. And so there's a joined up conversation that's needed. But of course, the MOJ only deals with life in court. And so this goes back to, well, how can we engage Department for Education? There's a Minister for Children with a long list of responsibilities, and the needs of children from families who live apart is not included on his list of responsibilities. So first thing is, let's get them in there. There's a Department for Health and Social Care, which deals with all the mental well-being of people going through this. So we need some political responsibility outside of the Ministry of Justice. That's quite a big ask.
But I agree with you. I know there's a Minister for Families and Justice. I wasn't aware that and it is a he, on his, because I heard him on the radio the other day, but I wasn't aware that wasn't on his list. I assumed it was on his list and it just was a very tiny focus. So to hear it's not even on the list is appalling. But does it need separate ministerial responsibilities for divorce, separation, or is it something other than that? I don't know whether you have a view on this, Kate, from a social policy perspective. How do we carve up government departments to best support the changes we want to make?
This government has made significant changes away from a system where this was all in place. So we now have a Department for Education. It was, of course, the Department for Children and Families. So we've seen quite a radical shift away from that thinking. I think it's highly unlikely, if not impossible, that we'll see a return to that approach under the current administration. And I think but that is an absolutely appropriate long-term goal. But every issue wants its own minister. So it is a go-to and it makes perfect sense. But it also can put you in direct competition with other issues. And it doesn't happen often. I think it can be more productive instead to focus on the more immediate realm of the profession and those that are more persuadable in the short term. Sadly, I don't think this is a political priority or will be anytime soon. That's not to say we shouldn't be aspiring to it and have a set of things that we want to see happen and change, but focusing on the system as it works currently and understanding where the vested interests are and how the case can be made to incentivize change among the existing vested interests, I think is where there's a lot of productive progress to be made.
What do you feel, Kate, about the increasing awareness in society generally of the importance not to use language in our everyday speak, which is harmful to particular groups of society? And to what extent might it be possible, dreaming dreams, to raise up the kind of concept that children are a vulnerable group when parents separate, and language which promotes hostility, acrimony, sides, battles, wars, etc. between parents is actively harmful to children and therefore should be avoided by all? Is that just dreaming dreams, or is that something that somebody might catch on to? And what would it take? A trendy, TikTok campaign, or how could it happen?
So I think they're great questions, Helen, and I think they're empirical questions, which is to say you can do research to understand the correct answer to that. But I would say that one thing that we consistently find through the research is that describing people as vulnerable often backfires because it's very othering. It's them over there, they're somehow in need. And that creates a distance and it makes it not my problem. It might make me momentarily sympathetic, but it's fundamentally creating a distance between me and the issue. So vulnerable doesn't tend to work, and where or it's like neutral or negative in its impact. Likewise, we've got to be really careful that we're not triggering a sense of guilt in people, right? That, I've harmed my children fundamentally, because not only is that unhelpful for those individuals, but it's also unhelpful there's plenty of blame out there for parents for one reason or another anyway, right? We don't need to add to that. And especially if it's something you did in the past, right? There's nothing you can do about it now. And we do have our research has found that we have strong mental models in the UK, whereby many of us we a kind of a mindset that's very easily triggered for us is this idea that damage done is damage done. So if something's gone wrong in the past, basically it's not a lot you can do about it. There's not a lot we can do. There's not a change that can be made. So that's really makes people find it very difficult to think of how things could be different or how you could improve them after the event. So instead, probably what we want to explore is if there's a way of highlighting the processes of early childhood and then adolescent development, which help to really shine a light on how your experiences and your relationships in particularly those really sensitive developmental periods, how your experiences and your relationships shape you, for better or for worse. And we have choices about those relationships and experiences. And so it's beholden on the adults to try to improve those relationships and experiences, right? And the more we understand about what children need in their development, the more it kind of shines a light on what we have responsibilities as adults to do. And it puts their needs at the center of decision making. And the more we can do that, the better decisions people make, because vast majority of us want what's best, right, for our kids. And so putting them at the center can neutralize a lot of the other issues. Another mental model that we commonly have is basically that development is automatic. So we think it's going to happen anyway, right? Kids just learn to walk. One minute they didn't, and then the next minute they did. It's not automatic. A lot's going on that serve and return interaction is what's making that possible. It's a product of their relationships and experiences. So the more we can kind of illuminate how kids develop, the more we can see how important getting those times right is, and the stronger the case for support, stronger the case for, talking to them, making them part of the process, Helen, as you say, then becomes.
And it all actually, what you say, all comes under the heading of Section 1 of the Children Act, which is that the welfare of the child is paramount importance. And everything speaks into that, doesn't it? I find it ironic that we have this fabulous piece of legislation, but the very system in which it exists undermines and destroys the thing which it says.
Yeah, it's like having a beautiful fish and no water to put it in, isn't it? I just wanted to squeeze one final point in, which is, we've talked about language, we've talked about other people using language. If you're a parent listening to this and you're going through a separation and you're keen to try and use the most helpful language to talk to your partner, to talk to your kids about this, what are the top tips you can give people when navigating that territory? Because ultimately, we're the front line, aren't we? The people who are in families, having conversations with our family members, trying to sort these things out. So what would you say, Helen, and to a parent listening to this?
There's one word which I think is the most important word for any parent who is separating. Again, caveat safety issues, but in the absence of those concerns, the key and most critical word to use with the children and elsewhere is we. Your mum and I are making decisions. We're so proud of you coming top in your French. Dad and I haven't yet worked out our holiday plans, but we will let you know. We are not happy with how long you're staying on the Xbox. We are so thrilled about this. We carries on after separation. And so the children are not thrust into two separate worlds of I. And I think that is the most important thing. Can be very difficult for a while. And I think we have to be realistic that these sort of rose-tinted spectacles of sort of glorious co-parenting doesn't happen automatically. But we try and encourage our clients to have a goal of where they're wanting to get to in 3 months, 6 months, or even a year, and to be able naturally to use the we pronoun with children to reassure them that team parent continues.
Fantastic. That's just such wonderful advice to end on. Kate and Helen, thank you so much, both of you, for a really fascinating and enjoyable conversation. Kate, where can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
At UK_frameworks on Twitter, or our website is frameworksinstitute.org.
Brilliant. And Helen?
I'm at Wells Family Mediation, or otherwise familysolutionsgroup.co.uk.
Thank you. And of course, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Kate_Daly. You can hear more about new podcast episodes by following at divorce_podcast. And if you've enjoyed this episode and would like to listen to more, then please subscribe for updates by visiting thedivorcepodcast.com. Helen and Kate, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for listening.